Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. One night 3 years ago, I got into a fight with my girlfriend at the time. In my rage, I stormed out of her house, got in my truck, and then just started driving. I hopped on the interstate and drove, and about an hour later, I was in Nashville, but I was still so pissed I decided to keep driving. I made it my goal to reach Kentucky and then turn around. I'd never been to Kentucky before, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, and when I reached there, it was about 2:30 in the morning, having left my town a little after 12:30. I grabbed a Coke and a biscuit from the first McDonald's I found, and then headed back to Alabama. As I was heading back, I realized I was running low on gas as I got to Nashville, so I pulled off Interstate 65, went down the off-ramp and hit a light. I made a left and hit another light. And here's where it gets weird. As I pulled up to this light, I noticed something strange. The only car on the road was stopped at the green light to the right. Weird, I thought, but hey, it's after 3 at this point. The guy could be tired. Once I reached the red light, however, the car rolled forward through the light and under the overpass for the interstate. And then I saw its brake lights on, and their headlights go out. They stopped under the overpass, and my heart started to race. I was sitting in the turning lane waiting for the light, and the gas station was right past the overpass, and that's where they were there waiting for me. I was freaking out. I watched my light turn green, then back to red. I was waiting to see if he would move, but they didn't. Finally, when the light switched to green again, I flicked on my high beams and crept through the intersection trying to make out their face, but I couldn't. Then, lo and behold, as soon as I passed them, their headlights turned on and they started moving again. At this point, I was scared shitless, staring at the headlights in my rearview mirror instead of the road, as I made the couple hundred of feet to the gas station. Thankfully, when I pulled in, the first thing I noticed was a cop car parked out front. So, I parked at the pump, and as I was getting out, I watched the car pull into the station and park. I started pumping my gas, and as soon as I was doing so, I watched a man exit the vehicle and start to walk inside the store. The whole time from the second his head popped out of the car to when he made it inside the store, he was staring at me, smiling like the soldier in that famous picture who was suffering from shell shock, and he was shaking his head left to right. He walked into the store and got in line right behind the cop. Now, maybe I've been watching too many movies, but the whole time he was standing there, I thought he was going to kill the cop, and thankfully he didn't. Once I had enough gas to get home, I stopped pumping, jumped in my car, and double-checked my phone for directions back to the interstate. As I was leaving the gas station, though, I noticed the man leave his place in line and run out of the store. That's when I panicked and I hit the gas. I ran the red light at the overpass, ran another red light, and then got back onto the interstate. I went about 85 to 90 miles an hour all the way home, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Still, one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me, and it reiterated to me what the detective told all incoming freshmen at orientation. Nothing good happens after 2 a.m. Crazy Road Trip, submitted by Heru Black. Here's something that happened to me and 2 other friends a couple of years back. Sorry it's so long, but it takes place over the course of a week. It was a pretty messed up road trip, and we didn't realize how scary it was until a few years later, because the entire time we were very, very high. It was March 2014, and my friends and I, I'll call them Steve and Karen, had just started a band together. I'm a guy who was pretty outgoing and friendly, and Steve was a quiet kid who was pretty masculine, or at least thought he was. He came from a suburban town in Cape Cod where he was valedictorian and also the class clown. Karen was a small, dirty blonde, pretty shy and quiet, but very friendly. An ex-scene kid like me, we both had hair over our eyes. Steve and Karen were in the beginnings of a relationship. We were in college and spring break was coming up soon. We had no plans, so we decided we were going to drive from Massachusetts to Florida to do some camping in some national forests, and then drive to New Orleans if we had the time. We weren't really experienced campers or road trippers, but we were depressed 19-year-olds who felt pretty invincible and had nothing better to do, so we figured, what the hell. That Sunday night, Karen had gotten us our first show in her home state of Connecticut, and I'm pretty sure we left right after. The ride down was nice, but an exhausting 24 hours. We got to Florida on Monday night around 1 a.m., tired as hell. We were so tired, and we'd been smoking, we didn't even try to find a campground. We pulled over and set up the tent in a slightly wooded area about 10 feet off the road. When we woke up and left the tent, we realized we'd actually been camping in a ditch, which we thought was pretty funny. We made it our goal that day to find a real campsite. Of course, we'd been smoking, and while we were at a gas station, Karen decided she was just going to go into the convenience store and ask people about any good camping spots. She came out having spoken to 2 rednecks who said they could lead us to some really good spots. Again, we were pretty high and thought, hey, this is great. The locals will definitely show us the best spots. We followed their pickup truck, smoking a bit more, until we ended up in the woods near a slow, shallow river. We got out, and they started telling us about what a great campsite this was in their thick Hick accents. We've got a lot of firewood, they said. We've been cutting it up, and we'd be happy to share it. You can swim right over there, but don't go out too far. There's gators out here. They were really trying to sell us this campsite. I thought the shorter redneck was kind of hot, chubby with a beard. You can ask my friends. I'm pretty much a bad man detector. If you think a guy is attractive or get a crush on one, you should run far away. I went up to Steve while they were talking to Karen about sharing food or something. We should, tell them we're going to go get firewood or something and just not come back, I said. He agreed, too high to remember the firewood they just offered to share with us 10 minutes before, and we used that same excuse. In the car, Karen said she'd been feeling weird about the way they were talking to her too, and was glad we'd come up with some way to slip away. Wouldn't it be so funny if we looked back and they were just following us? I said, trying to be funny. Don't even fucking joke about that, Karen said. Then I said, guys, looking back. Sure enough, there was the dirty old pickup truck, not 50 feet behind us. Super freaked out, we drove around making a lot of sharp turns. They kept up, though stayed at a distance. It had been a few hours of us frantically driving, and the sun had set, and we thought we'd lost them in the dark. It was probably around 10 at night or so when we found a campground you had to pay for, but we couldn't find anywhere to pay, so we just drove in, found a nice spot, and set up camp. We hadn't actually gotten any firewood, so super high, Karen and I set out into the dark to find anything we could burn. We kept joking about how the rednecks were going to jump out and get us, but Karen really started freaking out, saying, "Oh my God, we're so far from the campsite. We're lost. We're never going to find our way back, and the rednecks are going to find us and kill us." I reassure her and say, "Dude, we're literally 20 feet from the car. Look, the trees aren't even that thick. We can still see it." Yeah, we were high. We gathered a bunch of logs and some branches from trees that kind of looked like palm trees but were short and grew like bushes. We got back, and Steve had already started the fire with things that he'd found, so we broke out some sausages and cooked them over the fire and drank an entire bottle of wine. Extremely hungover, we got some groceries in the morning, and I got sick after eating an entire thing of birthday cake Oreos. Just before sunset, we found another campsite on the outskirts of the Ocala forest, about 100 feet from a road. We could see car headlights going by through the trees, and there were occupied campsites around, so we felt pretty safe. We smoked some more, made some food, and I was surprised I could still get some cell service, and I used the super slow internet on my phone to look up scary stories specifically about the Ocala forest. I found some stories about the Rainbow People, a supposed cult that lived in the Ocala forest and tried to make other people live there too. It didn't seem that scary, so we were disappointed after having waited about 10 minutes for the website to load. But suddenly, we heard a creak in the woods, just outside the light of the fire. We didn't think much of it until we heard a bunch more, all around us. It sounded like footsteps on the leaves. As always, very high, we started freaking out. We didn't think the rednecks would have followed us this far, but we still weren't sure. And having just watched the Blair Witch Project together a few weeks before, I joked, maybe it's the Ocala Witch. Steve told us to wait at the fire while he went to the car and turned the headlights on. Karen and I stood back to back with our pocket knives out, still not knowing if we were freaking out for no reason. Once Steve got the headlights on and drove closer to us, we got in and he did some donuts while we looked around to make sure everything was clear. When we were sure there wasn't anyone there, we joked more about this Ocala Witch and decided it was time to just go to sleep. We poured some water on the fire and got in the tent. We'd been laying in our sleeping bags for about 10 minutes when we noticed some light to the side of the tent. Our fire had started back up, and we were pretty freaked out since we dumped most of our water on it. The fire started to grow, and it got pretty big. "Is anybody going to go check on the Ocala Witch?" I said, looking over to Karen and Steve, who both looked at me and nodded no. Too scared to leave the tent, we eventually fell asleep, and when we woke up, the fire pit was still smoking, and it was completely ash. I mean, maybe it's explainable, but we were pretty scared at the time because some of the ash was a very distinct shade of blue. Steve tied some sticks together into figures and put them around the campsite to freak us out while we were packing up. Real funny. That night, we decided to go deeper into Ocala. We were driving around the forest looking for a camping spot while I was reading stories about the skunk ape that I had loaded onto my phone in advance. Of course, we were still smoking, and it was pretty late, really dark, and we were tired. We started to think we might have gone too deep to find a campsite, but the path was wide enough for a car, so why wouldn't there be a good spot? We came upon a line of cars in the middle of the forest, mostly looking pretty broken down with some graffiti on them. We kept going, and soon there were a bunch of people walking around. We drove up to one of them, a very tall, very bearded man who could have been the skunk ape himself. Rolling the window down just enough to talk to him, I asked, "Hey, what is this?" "A gathering," he said abruptly, with a really deep voice. "Of what?" I asked, confused. "Of people." We'd managed to stumble upon the Rainbow Gathering, the cult we read about the night before. Turns out, they were just hundreds of hippies living in the woods and were very hospitable. One guy, whose name I can't remember, decided to show us around, and he was really nice and introduced us to a bunch of people. The greeting and farewell was, "Lovin' you." He introduced us to his wife, who was pregnant with their 7th child. Everyone, again, was really nice. They taught us all about how they lived in the woods. If you got lost at night, you yelled, "Hey, I need an adult!" and someone would come find you. If you needed tobacco, you yelled, "Nick at night!" and there was a group that would come and give you some. They called lighters fire dragons, the outside world Babylonia, and didn't trade with money, which they referred to as Babylonian tickets, but rather they traded shiny rocks and pretty stuff. We were really high and having a lot of fun. They got us some food and took us to a drum circle, and they were all over the forest, sometimes 10 or 15-minute walks between sites. We knew it was a little weird, but we decided to go along with it. At one point, an old guy had Karen in his lap next to a bonfire, sipping on some mystery liquid from a thermos, but she seemed happy, so we didn't think much of it. We also met the one black hippie who was there, who only beatboxed, and he never spoke. We hung out with them for a couple of more hours before we got tired. And there were different camps throughout the forest, and our guide led us to his, which was called Camp Shut the Fuck Up. It was the quiet camp for all the parents with kids. We set up our tent and went to sleep. I woke up first and read a book in the tent since it was raining. By the time Karen and Steve woke up, the rain had stopped, and we went to hang out with some of the people at Camp Shut the Fuck Up. We talked with them for a little while and listened to their stories. Someone was talking pretty casually about how a girl had been dosed at another camp, and she was going crazy or something. We figured out through the context clues that dosed meant someone had given her a large amount of acid without her knowledge, and she understandably freaked out. We realized how weird the whole thing was and decided it was time to pack up and leave. As we were taking down the tent, we started to hear it. "You're doing it wrong." We heard people chanting. Not in unison, but randomly, one after another. We looked back, and there were a few people walking towards us. "You're doing it wrong," they kept shouting. We continued to dismantle the tent while one of them approached us. "You guys are packing up after only one night?" Karen replied, "Yeah, we want to get to New Orleans today." The guy replied, "No, you guys should stay longer. We've been living here for months. Gotta stay away from Babylonia. All that shit rots your brain." When we weren't receptive, they started getting more aggressive. "Check out these Babylonians. You're doing it wrong." I looked at him and said, "Dude, we have to be back at school in like 3 days." Someone from the back of the growing group of hippies between us and the path of Camp Shut the Fuck Up yelled out, "Quit school! Come live in the woods with us!" Someone else shouted, "Someone get the duct tape." Karen got mad and started arguing with them about us going to school. They were saying that we weren't doing anything by going to Babylonian school. And Karen argued that we were going to school so we could learn what we needed to actually make change in the world instead of just sitting in the forest and doing acid and littering. Finally, after what seemed like an hour with all these people yelling at us, we finished packing up the tent, and Karen had convinced some of them that we were on the same side and just doing it different ways. I think she just outsmarted them, really. They let us through, and our guide let us out of the forest, apologizing for the rest of them. "You're lucky we didn't duct tape you to a tree," someone shouted. It was about a half-hour walk back to the car, and whenever someone saw us with all of our gear, they shouted, "You're doing it wrong," or "Hey, have fun in Babylonia." We finally got to the forest entrance, and we met our guide's wife again, still very pregnant. She looked each of us in the eyes, smiled at us, and put her hands on our shoulders, and hugged us as if to say, "I'm glad you're getting out. I wish I could too." We drove to a park on the coast where manatees were supposed to swim, but I guess it was the wrong time of the year, so we just drove through a weird suburban island town before heading to New Orleans. We got there pretty late, and we were again exhausted. We couldn't find anywhere to set up camp because we were in a city, and we didn't really think this through. We found a lawn between a stadium and its parking lot, and Steve wanted to sleep in the tent, but Karen and I thought it was too cold and we should just sleep in the car. Steve still set up the tent, determined to sleep in it, and because they were kind of together, Karen decided she would too. I woke up to a flashlight blinding my face and someone banging on the window. I open the door and instantly the alarm goes off. There's 2 cops standing there, bewildered, asking me where the keys were so I could turn off the alarm, and I pointed to the tent about 10 feet away. Meanwhile, in the tent, the alarm had woken Steve and Karen up, and they thought someone had broken into the car, and if it hadn't been for the fact that I was in it, they would have been too scared to come out of the tent. However, they unzipped the tent with their knives ready, only to see the 2 cops. The cops called them over, asked to see all of our IDs, and asked what we were doing so far from home. We told them that we just didn't have anything else to do for spring break. They ran our IDs, and they said it was cold and that Steve and Karen could go back to the tent and I could go back in the car while I did it. Okay, I'm black and frequented Tumblr, where I had heard about police brutality and the latest minority killing by a cop on a daily basis. Oh God, we're in Louisiana. They're separating us because they're going to shoot me, I thought. Steve and Karen back in the tent had similar thoughts. They knocked down the window and called my friends from the tent, and luckily they didn't kill me. They told us to be safe, and then they went on their way. The rest of the trip was fine. We walked around New Orleans and hung out with some homeless travel kids on a pier. I bought them whiskey, and we thought it was funny that I was the only one that didn't need a chaser. Just as the sun was setting, we took off to make the day-and-a-half drive back home. And we made it back just in time to go to sleep and get up for school the next day. We were super lucky. I mean, the only reason we weren't more scared or observant was because we were high the entire time. A couple of years later, again, while high, we recounted the events to each other and realized just how dumb we'd been. We may laugh about it now, but there were so many times on that trip where things could have gone horribly wrong. Don't sleep on the side of the road. About 2 years ago, I was driving home from a family reunion pretty late at night, and the drive was about 2 hours. I didn't stay the night because I had to be back for work the following day, and most of the drive was on roads with dense bushes and trees on either side, the really creepy ones you see in a lot of movies. Anyway, I've been driving about 45 minutes, and I was starting to get really tired. You know how sometimes you suddenly just become really tired out of nowhere? Well, yeah, that happened to me. I knew I wasn't going to last, but I didn't come across any place that I felt I could park and safely sleep. After it became clear to me that I wasn't going to find a place to pull up, my tiredness wasn't going away, I did something very questionable. I pulled over to the side of the road onto the grass behind some bushes to try and hide my car from anyone else who was going to come past. The roads weren't empty. I came across another car every few minutes or so. I just made a mental note that the time was 11:22, and then fell asleep. Sometime later, I was awoken by a scratching sound. I looked at the clock, 11:50. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and because I was still extremely tired, I didn't bother looking around and simply went back to sleep. I was later awoken by the same sound again. It was now around 12:40. This time it really freaked me out because the sound didn't stop. The thought ran across my mind that maybe it was just an animal inspecting the car, but why would it return almost an hour after it had left the previous time? I looked in my rearview mirror and just managed to catch a glimpse of something running away into the forest. Now, at the time, I thought it was the damn hook killer. You know, the one that scratches the couple's car and then slaughters the guy when he gets out to investigate? Fuck that, I thought to myself, so I got the hell out of there. There was a bend no more than 100 yards up the road, and as I came around it, there was a fucking car parked off to the side of the road with the driver's side door open. I slowed down just to look to see if there was anyone in there, and there wasn't. And then I looked in my rearview mirror again. At first I didn't see anything, and all of a sudden, this guy came sprinting around the corner. He was screaming at me, shouting stuff like, "Hey, you, get the fuck out of your car now!" I noped the fuck out of there and sped off, and I never saw the guy again. Moral of the story? Don't fucking sleep on the side of a deserted road. He's getting closer. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning, so around 2 a.m. we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour, and we still had a few more hours to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me, because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road," he said. "He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper-aware of the car too, and entertained ourselves with watching it through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. But we got pretty tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother said, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel," she finally said. And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and this car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to turn its brights on, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel." And my dad did. The car kept driving, and I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as my dad parked the car right in front of him. He came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. car, the way it followed us, and how it was taunting us. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us that people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals all the time. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. So, relieved, we drove off with the police cruiser behind us, until about 10 minutes later when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's word and my mother's worst fears. That 10 minutes later, we saw the same car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting for us. Driving Cross Country, submitted by Terry from the Block. Back in 2009, I decided I was tired of my day job and wanted a change of scenery from the cold doldrums of Newark, New Jersey. I spoke with some friends from college that were living in San Francisco, and they convinced me to go out west too. I could crash with them as long as I liked until I found a job. So, from Thanksgiving time to March, I saved all of my money, did the nothing but ramen thing, then loaded up my hand-me-down Ford Explorer and planned my drive across the states. My father had bought me a Thule carrier for the roof, so with my little U-Haul trailer, I had everything all set to go, and I planned on sleeping in the back of the Explorer a couple of nights to save money. I didn't tell anyone I was going to do that, let alone my parents, who would have freaked out at that possibility. Before I go any further, I should let everyone know that I'm a petite female, 5'5", and weigh about 110 pounds. I was an avid runner back then and still am now, and was and am in very good shape if I do say so myself. I did a lot of kickboxing and training at the gym, so I thought if I did get into trouble, I'd be able to take care of myself. Back to the story. My plan was to head south first and then drive across through Tennessee, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona, and then head up through Southern California. It was adding about 10 hours of time to the drive, but I figured I'd stop and see things on the way and just kind of take my time. On my first leg, I drove to Roanoke, Virginia, and stopped for the night. Not a problem at all. I found a hotel that seemed like a decent spot to park in for the night, and then I walked to a local restaurant, got something to eat, cleaned up in their bathroom, and then crashed in my truck listening to the rain on the roof. The next day, I made for Memphis, and I figured I'd stop there, maybe see Graceland, and then get a room for the night, and that's exactly what I did. About 9 hours on the road, and I was getting sick of being in the car, and I drove by Graceland. It was too late to stop in, so I found myself at a Motel 6, and here is where the trouble began. Right away, I knew something was wrong with the place. I mean, it was seedy, and I mean seedy. What can you expect from a place like that, right? But it wasn't until too late that I thought something was wrong. I got some more food and found that the back door to the building wasn't locked at all. I mean, it was wide open. Some security. I went to the front desk to tell them that this was unacceptable, but no one there spoke very good English, and I just gave up and went to my room and turned all the locks I could on and then pushed a chair up against the door. I knew what kinds of people were probably staying at a cheap-ass joint like this. The next morning, I got up early, showered, and was going to get on the road right away. But there was an issue. There was this guy standing by my truck looking into the windows. Not being a shy girl, I walked right up to him and asked him what he was doing. He jumped a little and then turned around. Then he smiled at me and said he liked my truck. I said, "That's nice," and then asked him to back away from it and told him that I was in a hurry. I took a good look at him as he stepped away with his hands up to his chest. "Sorry, pretty lady. No offense. Hey, can I buy you breakfast?" he asked. He was about 6 feet tall, dark hair, dark complexion, thin and not unattractive, but he just seemed weird. I mean, staring into my truck like he was going to break into it and then ask me to breakfast just made things even stranger. I politely said, "No thanks," and just got behind the wheel and started to drive off. He sort of stood off to the side and waved at me, and I watched him continue to look at me in my side view mirror. Oh well, I thought as I pulled onto the road, some local goofball, whatever. I stopped for gas and got back on the highway and put some miles in. I finally stopped in Salisaw, Oklahoma to stretch, get some food and gas, and my friend Gene called me and asked where I was, and we chatted for a few minutes, and while I sat in my truck eating, I looked over and couldn't believe my eyes. Standing by the edge of the parking lot next to a dirty white car was the guy from the Memphis parking lot. He was looking at a map spread out onto the hood of his car, but every once in a while, he looked up at me, or at least in the direction of my truck. He couldn't see me face to face, but he was definitely looking in my direction. I told Jean about him, and she said I was probably mistaken and was just creeped out about the meeting that I had with him in the morning. When I looked over again, the car was there, but the guy wasn't. I agreed with Jean that it was probably just a silly coincidence, and maybe it was just someone else that looked like that guy. Got some more gas, and then got back on the interstate. I wasn't tired, and after 1 or 2 more pit stops, I made it to Amarillo and planned on sleeping in the back of the truck again. I wrote an email to my parents saying something about how fast it went from being the start of spring in one area to the brown of Texas in the next instant. I was shot, so I drifted away and didn't wake up until about 2 in the morning. That's when I heard something right outside of my truck. I was parked in an Embassy Suites this time to avoid the creep factor or a cheap place, but that didn't help things at all. I opened my eyes to see a flashlight pointing in on me, and I immediately screamed. The light didn't go out for a second, and I thought maybe it was hotel security or the police. But then the light turned off, and whoever was out there bumped the side of my truck as they turned around, and I saw a tall, dark shape run away, and then under a parking lot light. Yeah, it looked like that guy. I freaked out, scrambled to put my sneakers on. I was only wearing a t-shirt and a pair of Umbro soccer shorts, and I felt so violated and naked, wondering how long that person was staring in at me. I thought of the guy as I pulled out of the parking lot, and after a few minutes, I pulled over and called Jean. She was still up and hanging out with my other friends, and I told them all what had happened. I was too keyed up to go back to sleep, so I made for Albuquerque, about 4 hours or so away by Chris's MapQuest search that he did on his laptop for me. On the way there, I stopped once for coffee and gas, but there wasn't a lot of traffic on Interstate 40. I was trying to calm myself down and reassure myself that it was probably just security that looked in on me, and then they got scared when I screamed. But suddenly, a car behind me came up with its brights on. They were right in my side view mirror, and I had to dodge my head over to get the light out of my eyes. Whoever this was stayed behind me for about 5 miles, and by that time I was yelling out curse words and telling him to turn his effing brights off. I slowed down, and the car slowed down too. I started to pull over to give this person even more room to pass if that's what he wanted to do, so it wasn't an issue, but suddenly the car sped right past me. It was the white car I had seen at the Sonic. I was sure of it. I waited a few minutes and then started driving again, really freaking out. I got out my phone and dialed Jean again, and I was so busy freaking out on her that I didn't notice the white car had slowed down and now I was passing it. The car got behind me again, and of course, on came the brights. Now I was really panicking, and I didn't know what to do. After about 10 minutes of me screaming and crying to Jean, the car again went around me and sped into the distance, and I took the next exit to a Flying J, hoping to throw this person off. There was a police car in the lot, and I went right over to him and blathered out my story. The police officer was very nice and listened to me and asked a lot of questions. Where I was from, where I was going, who I knew was out here, stuff like that. Even down to had I been drinking or doing any drugs. He decided that I hadn't been and suggested I get a room in town. He radioed a description of the car out to all the other officers so they would be aware of what was going on, and he led me to a Holiday Inn, and I got a room after parking in the back. The officer said he'd follow up with me later, and Jean called me back and I told her where I was and then just crashed. I woke up in the morning and called my parents and let them know what was going on, and the officer came to the hotel before he went off shift and said that they hadn't seen anything and that I was probably okay to keep moving. I went to get some food, and when I got back to my truck, on the windshield written in what I think was toothpaste were the words, "Nice try." I freaked the hell out and called the police again. They came out, took pictures of my windshield, and made me do a formal statement. I didn't know whether to scream or cry or what. I called my parents again, and my dad wanted to come and get me, but ended up buying a plane ticket for Jean to fly to Albuquerque and then finish the drive with me. Somewhat calmer, I asked the police officer about a different place to spend the night before driving to Albuquerque, and they said to leave my truck at the Holiday Inn, and then drove me to this quirky little place called the Blue Swallow Motel. Whoever was following me, I just didn't want them to know where I was. Strangely enough, the Blue Swallow Motel was actually pretty cool, and I actually still have some pictures that I took of it before I actually went to bed. I spent the rest of my day sleeping and was planning on getting a ride back to the hotel early in the next morning to get my truck and then driving to meet Jean in the morning. I woke up at about 4 and I was feeling a little better, and the police said that they would take me to my truck, which I was very thankful for. While I was on the phone with them, I looked out the window of my room, and there was that friggin' white car in the parking lot. I didn't freak out this time. I calmly told the police that the car was there, and they said to stay put. But just as if he had heard me, the car lights came on, and it tore out of the parking lot. I wanted out of this so bad at this point and was beyond shaken up. I wanted to either go home or be in San Francisco with my friends. The police came, others were driving around looking for the car and driver, but I insisted I needed to get out of there. A police car followed me for quite a while once I got back on the interstate, and nothing happened for the rest of my drive to Albuquerque. I went to the airport in the morning, Jean got there, and then we drove non-stop to San Francisco. About a week later, I was cleaning out the back of my truck when I found a piece of paper folded up. I thought it was just a piece of garbage for my trip, but I opened it anyway, and inside, written in crude kid-like letters, was the message, "You got lucky. I have to go home." I ran inside my friend's apartment and showed it to her, and we called the police. There was obviously nothing much they could do about it, but they said they'd let the Tucumcari police know about it. That was the town that I had stopped in New Mexico. They did ask for it, and I gladly gave it to them after taking a picture of it. I didn't want that hanging around. So yeah, that was a messed up drive, and I will never drive cross-country again, even if I'm with people. I'll fly next time. I try not to think about it, but when my mind does wander to those days, I'm terrified as to what that person was planning on doing to me. It's scary to think about it, even to this day. Rest Stop Horror by Wonder Are Not Lost. This isn't my story. It's my dad's, and it happened about 4 years ago while he was on a business trip for work. He's still freaked out about it to this day and gave me permission to post it here. My dad works for a large printing company, and they had completed an overnight rush job for a business. My dad got tasked with dropping the order off, and it would take 8 hours each way to drop off the order. He was going to take my mom as she's a retired teacher, and he figured it would be nice to have someone to drive each way. However, the night before he was going to leave, my mom came down with the flu. He left early the next morning and promised my mom if he got tired he would stop either at a restaurant or rest stop. He made it without incident to drop off the papers, and it was about noon when he set off again and soon realized the traffic was horrible. My dad decided that he'd take the long way home. It would add an hour or two, but he feared it would take longer if he waited in the traffic. He drove straight for hours until he realized he had to pee, and badly. My dad is a prostate cancer survivor, so needless to say, he pees. A lot. Also, he was starting to get sleepy, and figured he should pull over and maybe get a quick nap in. It was winter, so at 4:30 the sun was starting to set, and he noticed a rest stop ahead. He got out, called my mom to tell her he was stopping to stretch his legs and maybe catch a little nap and then head to the bathrooms. The place was pretty much deserted, but there was an old Chevy parked next to my dad, and then there was an RV with the family packing up what was probably their dinner. He went into the bathroom and opened the first stall. He was in there doing his business when he heard someone talking. He thought at first they were talking to him until he realized the person was A, on the phone, or B, talking to themselves. "It's okay. It's going to be okay. We'll just take another, and then we will bring it to Mother," the man said to himself in a sing-songy voice. My dad said he sounded like he was young, between late teens or early 20s. Then, before my dad could say anything while he zipped up his pants, started to get a little freak out when the guy started screaming and beating his head while screaming at himself in a woman's high falsetto. "You're a stupid boy! A stupid, stupid boy! Mother is very angry!" At that, my dad ran out of the stall, and he quickly opened the door and ran to his car. He locked the car door when he noticed a skinny young man run out of the bathroom. He was looking for my dad and saw him in his car. My dad had the car started and was backing up when the guy ran full tilt at him, screaming. My dad just drove off. He was so shaken up by this, he pulled over in the next town at a diner, getting a coffee to go. He was paying for his coffee when that same Chevy pulled in. My dad grabbed his coffee and hid his face looking at some knickknacks in the little gift shop. The kid walked in and went up to the nice old cashier who my dad bought his coffee from, and he threw his arms around the woman and started sobbing about how he's sorry, Mother, and how he let another one get away. My dad heard enough. He quickly tossed his coffee he hadn't even drunk yet as it was too hot, and he made his way slowly to his car, got in, and sped off. He didn't stop until he was safely home. To this day, my dad refuses to stop at rest stops. So, creepy rest stop Norman Bates and your mother, I hope my father or I never meet you again. The Gas Station, submitted by Bonnaroo Boy. This happened to me in 2005. I was in the summer before my senior year of college and waiting to start my summer job. I grew up and lived in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and my parents were going away for a week to spend time with their friends in Myrtle Beach. My job didn't kick off for a couple of weeks after I came home from college, so I was kind of stoked to have the house to myself for a week alone. Not that I don't like my family, but at that age with a little bit of cash in my pocket, an empty house, well, you get the idea it was a nice way to transition from school to summer. My parents left and made the 5-hour drive to see my dad's high school best friend and some other folks. The first night I just kind of hung out and had some beers around the house with some pals when I got a phone call the next morning. It was my dad. He asked me a favor that was more of a favor to me than for him. At least that's what I thought at the time. For some reason, I suppose maybe to just show off his ride, he asked me to drive his brand new Corvette C6 down to him. They had taken my mom's Escalade, but now he wanted his baby. Mind you, I had ridden in this car once, and drove it only once, under the unbelievably strict eye of my dad. I love my dad, and he is an awesome guy, always was. But when it came to his cars, he was very protective, treating them like they were my little brothers, and not just that, he has a really neat collection of cars. This just happened to be his newest. So when I talked to him, I said, yeah, sure, I can do that. And over the phone, he gave me the directions that he wanted me to take and said I could drive the Escalade back home, or I could hang out with them for a bit too. I asked if I could bring my friend Tobin, and he actually liked the idea of me having someone else for the drive. Tobin was one of my oldest friends and a very devout Christian. My parents thought he was an unbelievably great influence on me for all things good. But even in his devoutness, Tobin did cut loose once in a while. But that's neither here nor there. He still is one of my best friends to this day, and this trip would solidify our friendship. All the arrangements were made, and Tobin and I planned to stay a couple of days with my parents and their friends. Just planned to hang out on the beach and maybe scam on some girls. Typical early 20s stuff. My dad laid down the law and said in no particular terms, but in this particular term, no bullshit. He was dead silent after he said it, and I said, yes, sir. And he repeated himself saying, Christopher, no bullshit. He let it sink in again. Then he laughed and said, keep it under 120, knowing full well that I was not going to go anywhere near 120, despite the power of the vehicle that went well past 120. As far as I know and what I've learned about the car, it does top off around 180. 400 plus horses or so will do that. So Tobin got to my house. I made sure that my phone was charged, and with our light packing, we set off. I called my dad and let him know I would also call him from the road if we stopped for gas. I couldn't believe he was actually letting me do this. And I'm not going to lie, I was really excited. That feeling would change on what would become one of the creepiest rides of my life. Feeling like James Bond, I pulled out and began the journey. We had tunes rocking and were psyched to be cruising down the road in this killer vehicle. The trip was going smoothly and I was enjoying the feel of it on the open road. There's just something about driving a Corvette that's beyond comparison. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have a lot of really sweet rides as well, but as a college kid, I was in heaven. Everything was great. The sun was shining, the tunes were rocking, and we were making excellent time. We were about 80 miles outside of Columbia, South Carolina, when we were down to a little over a quarter tank of gas. I wanted to make sure that the tank was always close to full, so I made the decision to stop for gas. I saw a sign for gas and made my way off Route 26. We had to drive a little bit to find the gas station, and when I say we were in the middle of nowhere, I mean we were in the middle of nowhere. I would have preferred to stop at a larger rest area, but for whatever reason just wanted to fill up the tank too. My first mistake. I should have waited for a better place. So we drove for about 5 or 6 miles off the highway and came to a crossroads. Not gonna lie, it was pretty creepy. Despite the sunshine and a little breeze, this little intersection had nothing on one corner, a rundown church on one corner, this dumpy little gas station, and another empty building that looked like an old post office or something on the last corner. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed there were no other vehicles there except for cars parked that were obviously being attended to by the mechanic of the gas station. It wasn't just a gas station, it was also a vehicle repair shop. The sun went behind some clouds and the breeze made it feel very surreal. I shut the vehicle off after pulling up to a pump, the only pump mind you, and it was dead silent except for the wind. There was no sound other than that wind. We got out and I went over to start the pump, but it was a very old-fashioned pump and it looked like I would have to pay first. I went to the door of the service station and didn't see anyone inside. Again, it was so quiet. I tried the door and it felt like it was locked, and I thought, oh great, this place is closed or hasn't been open for forever. But then the door gave a little and opened. I stepped in and there was only the whir of an air conditioning unit. I looked around and saw a door to the garage area and I went over to it to see if there was someone in there working on a car that could start the pump for me. This door was also pretty sticky, but it gave way with a loud bump and I stepped into the garage. There was a radio playing faintly, but other than that, it was also dead silent in here. I called out, "Hello, I'd like to get some gas if I could, please." I was trying to maintain a positive attitude, but there was something so off-putting about this gas station and this whole area for that matter. I don't know why, but it made me feel uneasy. I got no answer, so I walked farther into the garage. There was only one car at the far end, and I looked down at all the stuff soiling the concrete. Oil, God knows what. But oh my God, I think I saw blood. I kneeled down, and it was blood. There was a pool of it, and streaks of it heading towards another door at the far end of the garage. I immediately thought someone was hurt and called out, Hey, are you okay?" No answer. Then I heard a loud thud from beyond the door at the far end of the garage. I walked over to it and saw bloody handprints on the door, a little on the glass above the door handle, and smears of blood all over the handle. There were also some bloody footprints in the mess on the floor. There was no way I was touching the door, so I called out again. "Is everything okay?" Then my unease went to panic. Something was very wrong here, and I wondered if I should just call 911. I quickly turned around and headed back the way I came and went out the door back to Tobin in the car. I told him what I had seen, and he said maybe we should call the police. Then we heard another sound and some soft yelling from around the corner of the garage. We both walked over to it slowly, muttering something about how this wasn't right and we probably should just leave. But for whatever reason, we kept walking. We got to the edge of the garage, and when we went around the edge, we saw a man and a woman dragging a man towards a fenced-off area. The guy was covered in blood, and they both had blood on their arms and clothes. This wasn't an accident. The guy they were pulling looked dead. They were just dragging him along. And if he wasn't dead, he was certainly knocked out. And I don't know what else might have been wrong with him, but he wasn't moving at all. And when I say covered, I mean covered. His face was pointed upwards toward the sky and was bloody as all hell, and so were his clothes. Tobin and I both stopped and stood rooted with shock. That's when the woman looked up at us and gave us the creepiest grin I have ever seen in my life. A grin with no teeth. She laughed, and the guy who was helping to carry this body also looked up and didn't say anything for a minute. But then he dropped the arm of the guy they were dragging and started giggling as he looked at us. He took a step forward, and I spun around so quickly I punched Tobin in the side of his face when I brought my elbow around. I mean, I was like pirouetting or something. I yelled at him, "Let's get the fuck out of here!" We ran back to the car and jumped in, not even bothering to put our seatbelts on. I started it up, dropped it into reverse, and hit the gas. When I cleared the pump, I popped it into first and sent up a spray of dirt and gravel and dust behind us. But before I made the turn to get out of the parking lot, I saw both the man and woman coming around the corner of the garage. They stopped moving and just stood there staring at us. That was the last look I had of them as I got back onto the road, screamed around a corner onto the road that brought us into this creepy-ass part of the state, and floored it back towards the highway. Thank God it was a straight shot and very flat, because I did go over 120 miles an hour, despite promising my dad I wouldn't. I just wanted to get the hell away from that place as fast as possible. Tobin and I didn't say a word as we flew back towards Route 26. When we finally got to the junction, I finally said, "What the hell was that? That was fucked up, man. What do we do?" Tobin was silent for a minute. Then he said, "I don't think we should do anything. I don't think we should get involved." To add insult to injury, there was a gas station right across the highway on the other side. Had I just made a left instead of a right, we would have gotten gas at a proper gas station. But because I made the wrong choice and turned the wrong way, we had just seen something that I know was not an accident. For whatever it is in my being, I know those two had done something awful to that other guy. And here's the part where people will probably criticize me in the comments and tell me that we were both assholes for not calling for help. But that's what we did. We didn't get involved. And maybe we should have. We went over to the other gas station without saying another word to each other. I got out, filled up the tank, and got back on the road, determined not to stop until we got to Myrtle Beach. I would fill up with gas once we got there as well. I didn't care if we were running on fumes when we got there. Once back on the road, we could not stop talking about what we had seen, and I told Tobin over and over about what I had seen in the garage. We decided that we would find a phone in Myrtle Beach and call the state police and tell them what we had seen, but we weren't going to give them any information about ourselves. Go ahead. Call us chicken shits or whatever, but that was the decision we made. We also decided not to tell anyone else what had happened. Not my parents, not his parents, not our friends, no one. When we got to the outskirts of Myrtle Beach, we found another gas station with a working payphone, and I made the call. I let them know what exit it was, but I didn't know what the town was, and I said I think there's been a terrible accident. We stopped for gas, but only when we saw blood in the garage, then we got scared and ran. I didn't tell them about the two other people or the way they were dragging the man. I let them ask me a couple of questions, but said, "That's all I can tell you. You might want to go and check things out." Then I hung up before they asked for any of my identification. I didn't even get gas at that gas station. I had parked across the street and walked over. I got back to the car, drove to another gas station, filled up the tank, and then we found our way to the beach house my parents were staying at. We did our best to play everything off nonchalantly. My dad, of course, went over the car with a fine-tooth comb to make sure there had been no shenanigans on our part. He was pleased that everything was in great shape, slapped me on the shoulder, gave Tobin a slap too, and then got us some beers. And that was the end of it. We spent the next couple of days trying to relax, but it was hard knowing that something crazy happened out at that gas station. I never heard anything about it and never saw anything on the news or anything like that. Not like it would have made huge news being that it happened in the middle of nowhere anyway. To this day, Tobin and I never told anyone about what we had experienced. This is the first time outside of the two of us that I have ever said anything. When I look back, I shudder about seeing all that blood, that body that I was convinced and still am convinced was a dead man, and the faces on those two people, that toothless grin, and that crazy weird giggle the guy made. Christopher is not my real name, neither is it Tobin's. In time we let it go for the most part, but since that fateful day I have never gotten off the highway on any road trip to get gas or anything else unless it is a full rest stop, or a truck stop that's well lit and people are around. I don't think I will ever make the mistake of driving to some backwoods gas station for fear that I might see something that I don't ever want to see again. The Creeps in the RV, submitted by Jonette92. 10 years ago, I was living in Denver, Colorado, working as a nurse. I've since moved to Los Angeles, but at the time I was 29 and making a decent living in Denver. When this went down, I was traveling home for a week vacation to Des Moines, Iowa. It's about a 9-hour drive or so, and rather than spend half the day driving on a Saturday, I had gotten out of work early on Friday and was going to drive through the afternoon and evening to my parents' house. I was super excited to see my family as I had not been home for over a year. My boyfriend was on a work trip that was just ending, and he rearranged to change his flight from New York to Des Moines to meet me there. It was going to be an awesome week of relaxation and fun, and I couldn't wait to get there. I was so excited I had packed my Jeep Cherokee the night before, and actually left my clinic in my scrubs just to get going. After a few hours of driving, I decided to take a break to get some water and snacks at a rest stop just outside of Ogallala, Nebraska. It was basically just a spot to stop and rest, no big gas station and restaurants or things like that. There were a couple of families there, one of which played an important role in my story. It was a father and son walking their dog close to where I was parked. After I made a quick bathroom break, got a couple of bottles of water and some chips, I walked back to my Cherokee to find an RV had parked one spot over from me. I thought that was odd as there were plenty of other places to park, but this person chose to park right next to me. As I walked up to my Jeep, and before I could even get my door open, the door to the RV opened up and a woman stepped out and looked around. She then saw me and said, "Oh, thank gosh, are you a nurse?" Obviously, she got the idea due to me wearing my scrubs. I said, "Yes, I am. Is there anything I can help you with?" She said, "Yes, there's something wrong with my son and we can't figure out what it is." I put my stuff on the roof of my Cherokee and started asking basic questions like, "How old is your son? What types of symptoms is he showing?" Basically trying to get an idea of what was wrong with her kid. Right off the bat, she couldn't answer these simple questions. She eventually got around to answering them, but it was odd in the way that she did it. Like when I asked how old her son was, she hesitated before saying 3. She also kept looking over her shoulder back at the door of the RV. When she finally said that her son had broken out in hives and was having a hard time breathing, I asked a little bit about allergies and that sort of thing, and if they had an EpiPen or any kind of treatment for things that they might be aware of. She looked at me with a blank look and said she didn't even know what an EpiPen was. At first I thought the woman was just a pinhead, but then she asked if I could get on the RV and check out her son. I am always happy to help people out, but this was kind of an odd situation, and I immediately felt uncomfortable. But, at the same time, I also wanted to help her if there was a child in danger. She kept asking me to get on the RV, and I asked where her husband was. And she said she wasn't married, but her boyfriend was with their child who was laying down. All the while she answered that question, she was looking over my shoulder into the parking lot. I remember sighing for a second, before the woman then grabbed my arm and said, "Please, you need to help me," and began pulling me towards the open RV door. I immediately hesitated and pulled my arm back, but she had a very good grip on it and kept yanking me towards the RV. For whatever reason, maybe just out of shock, I didn't yell or scream for help. I was more pissed off that this woman was touching me and trying to pull me into the vehicle. I then heard a voice from inside the RV yelling, hurry up, get her in here." The woman continued to drag me towards the open door when I put my foot up on the side of the RV to stop her from getting me any further. That's when the man and his son who were walking the dog came running over with their big golden retriever to help me out. He helped me get away from the woman, who immediately got into the RV and shut the door. The guy was asking if I was okay, and I said yes as the RV started up and slowly backed out. The guy told his son to take pictures of the license plate with his phone, but it turns out they didn't have one on the front of the RV, and by the time the kid realized that the RV was pulling away, he didn't think to take a picture of the back. I didn't hold it against him. The kid was only about 8. I calmed down and thanked the man for giving me a hand and told him what had happened. He said he actually saw the RV pull up when he and his son got out to take their dog for a walk, and never saw the woman, but he did see 3 men get out and look up and down the parking lot, with one of them going towards the bathrooms. Then they all went back to the RV before I came back to my Cherokee. I got my stuff in my Jeep and called the police right away to tell them what happened and give them a description of the big RV. I figured it wouldn't be that hard to find. I gave them all my information and let them know I was going to continue on my journey as I was calm enough to do so. They never sent anyone out to talk to me, which was fine as I just wanted to get the hell out of there and chalk this up to just being a creepy experience. Only stopping one more time for gas, I got to Des Moines later that evening and met my boyfriend at my parents' house. My dad had picked him up as he had gotten an earlier flight. I told them everything that happened at the rest stop, and they were extremely happy that I had gotten away from what obviously was going to turn into a bad situation. Upon a follow-up call from the police, they told me that they never saw or had any reports of that RV on Interstate 80. So, while nothing truly scary happened, I was shaken up a little bit by the event. Who knows what would have happened had I been yanked into that RV? I don't like to think about it with all the crazy stories I hear in the news and even worse stories on channels like yours. I'm just happy to say that there was a great citizen out there who stepped in time to save me from a possible bad fate. I won't share his last name, but I will say thank you, George. Thank you to you and your son and your cute doggie. I don't know what I would have done had you not helped me that day in Nebraska. Unplanned Goodbye by Josh R. I get chills when I think of this story. It was May of '91. I was 31 and on my first solo cross-country motorcycle trip. I was thrilled. I'd gone from Tucson to LA and then headed east on Route 50 for a cross-continental ride back to Maryland. My Honda 1100 Shadow wasn't equipped with a gas gauge, but a full tank normally yielded about 145 miles. Wind, weight, and acceleration would make it less. I was on Route 50 in western Kansas, and the winds were fierce. I was constantly calculating mileage versus distance between gas stations, and it was hard. They weren't spaced closely together. I didn't properly anticipate the effect of wind and found myself in trouble. I hit my reserve level, and there was a tiny town 5 miles ahead. No town for 30 miles after that. No gas in 5 miles? I'd be stranded. There was a rest stop just ahead, and I noticed a landscape trailer, so I pulled over. I figured he'd have a gas can for the mowers, but he didn't. A woman was getting ready to pull out, and she seemed nice enough. I asked if she knew where I could get gas nearby, and she said the town didn't have a gas station, but she had a farm, and if I would follow her there, she had gas tanks for the farm equipment. I followed her old International Scout just a few miles from the rest area to a farm. Typical of that area, it was flat as a pancake, and her home was surrounded by trees to block the dust carrying on unyielding gusts. Next to the house was a massive steel pole building. She slid open the door to turn on the pumps, and inside were 2 fancy crop dusting planes. She closed the door, I filled up my bike tank, and we headed inside for a cup of coffee. She was alone, and it seemed risky for her to help a stranger on a bike with no men around, but I was grateful nonetheless. We sat down while the coffee was brewing, and she cut a couple slices of cake. Then she started to cry. Not full-on bawling, mind you, but her eyes got wet and she couldn't speak for a moment. Of course, I asked her what was wrong. She stood up and made her way to the bookshelf where she grabbed a picture and brought it over to me. It was a young man around my age, standing next to a crop dusting plane. And holy cow, he looked like me. Now, I never think I look like anybody that other people think are my doppelganger, even my kids. But in this case, it was downright spooky. It was me in a flight jacket. I said, "Is this your son?" And of course she said yes. She explained that her husband had died of a heart attack a year earlier, and just 3 months ago her son died testing a new German crop duster. The plane had been faulty, which made his death that much more agonizing. More than anything, she had simply lost the 2 men in her life that were her everything, over just 9 months. We spent an hour talking. She wanted to know all about me and to tell me all about her son. After a while, she said we were very much alike in spirit, that many things I said could have been verbatim from her son's mouth. While I enjoyed mildly dangerous pursuits, I was no crop duster pilot. But to her, she felt I was sent to her for a reason. She said so. I knew it, and I was both sad and grateful. So was she. The long hug we shared when I left wasn't the least bit uncomfortable. It was sincere and pure, a moment of raw, unscripted understanding and connection. It was actually hard to leave her, but the time was right and I was on my way. Thoughts and flashbacks of our interaction filled my head on and off that entire trip, and for weeks after I arrived home. She had given me a business card while we were outside filling the gas tank, and my inclination was to write back, to acknowledge that our meeting was important, and even to say I was there for her if she needed someone. But after much thought, I chose not to write. I would never be back in western Kansas, and could never be the kind of support she had to have available from friends and family. But the real reason was that moment was perfect. Spiritual. Some sort of incredible empathy or divine intervention. It meant something to her, and meant something to me. Nothing I could say or do after that visit would ever do justice to that moment where her son came home just long enough to say goodbye.
Stalker Truck by Jarreton 1781. The creepiest drive I ever had was back in 2008 when I was moving from Seattle to Washington, D.C. The route was down to Portland, then I-84 to I-80 to I-76 to I-70 to I-270. Immediately heading out of Portland, I passed an old F-100 going very slow. It was in primer black with no license plates. A cool truck, I thought, and didn't really pay it any other mind. I noticed about an hour later that the same truck was a couple of car lengths behind me. Odd. After getting back to some open roads, he disappeared into the distance behind me. That first night I stopped somewhere in Idaho, shitty cheap local motel, and I'm the only one there. I woke up the next morning and parked one spot away from me was that primered black F-100. I took off, continuing my trek southeast. Every single time I stopped for gas, at a rest stop, or get slowed down for traffic, that old Ford showed up in my rearview mirror again. This was bizarre. Nearing the end of Nebraska, I pulled over to get gas and decided to drive one more tank and then stop for the day. I pulled back onto the highway, and Mr. Truck is right there shadowing me again. About 30 minutes later, I realize I'm too tired to get to the end of that tank and decide to stop in the next town just over the border in Iowa. As I was getting off the road, I see that pickup pass on, carrying down the highway. I guess he had more endurance than I did. I woke up the next morning, and you know what's coming. That damn truck is in the hotel parking lot again. Up to this point, I just figured I was driving Hare to his tortoise, and we just happened to be making the same west-east coast trip. Now I had that weird light feeling in my stomach, like something was just off. I asked the clerk when turning in my keys, "What's up with that truck? When did it come in?" She says she wasn't working last night and wasn't sure, and also probably thought I was crazy, which maybe I was. Anyhow, at that point I figured it must be a coincidence, and this has to be a different truck. I mean, there were a lot of F-100s made, and there's bound to be a couple in the country that are primer black running with no plates. As I go to head out, I see the truck turning out of the parking lot in the direction that leads him away from the highway. Couldn't have been the same one from before. The guy didn't turn in his keys, so he was probably staying locally. I get back on the highway. No truck. I run to the end of the tank and get gas and some snacks. I get back on the road, then I merge in two cars in front of a primer black F-100. What the hell? At that point I decide, screw it, I'm marathoning the rest of the way. It's less than 20 hours, so it shouldn't be so bad, and I don't want to stay at another shitty motel with strange ghost trucks stalking me. The pattern continues with the truck showing up behind me every single time I take a break or get gas or get slowed in traffic. It was dark when I got to the I-70-270 split, and the old headlights are glowing back on the horizon. I know it's him. I wonder if it's going to follow me down 270 and park down the street near my house the next morning when I wake up. Alas, the truck continued on 70, and I never saw it again. Looking back, it was probably a confluence or a coincidence. It still feels really odd to me, though, because it's not like there were a lot of F-100s doing interstate runs in 2008. I also realized that I never got a good look at the driver. Not that there was no driver, but in my memories, all I see is an indistinct human-shaped thing driving an old truck that stalked me for 3,000 miles. Screaming Demons of Hicks Road by Miguel. I'm going to tell you about the time I took Hicks Road in San Jose, and while I'll never do it again. It was getting late, and all I had for company was my car's radio. I had the windows rolled down, which allowed the nice breeze to come through my vehicle and whisk around my ears. I mean, seriously, this was an amazing time for a nice drive. As the hour grew late, I flicked on my high beams and traveled back towards my house, but I decided to take the more scenic route, which was Hicks Road. While on the road, I noticed that my high beams kept reflecting on eyeballs off the road. I just summed it up to be some sort of wildlife, but I was terribly wrong. Nature began to call on my little drive, so I decided to do what any red-blooded American would do in this given situation. I pulled over to the side of the road to take a leak. I got out of my vehicle, left the radio on as well as my lights. That way, if a passing vehicle came by, they wouldn't hit it. As I was standing there doing my business, it really bothered me how silent it was outside. I mean, for all of this wildlife I had spotted on the drive, I didn't even hear crickets. With my lights in the car left on, I noticed that they were reflecting on eyes in the distance. Still, I assumed it was wildlife, but why couldn't I hear anything? While I was standing there, something just didn't feel right, and that's when the smell hit me. I have absolutely no idea what this smell was, but it hit me like a ton of bricks, and it stunk so bad I almost puked all over the ground in front of me. It was the smell of some sort of rotten meat mixed with, like, spoiled milk or something. Once I regained myself, I looked out to the field and all around me. That's when I noticed the number of eyes in the field had nearly tripled, and they were watching me. It was creeping me out, and I was ready to get the hell out of there. That's when I noticed the eyes were actually getting closer. As I struggled to zip up my pants and make sure everything was tucked in, I noticed the eyes were approaching much faster than before. Whatever it was running at me. So I quickly made my way back to my car as fast as I could, banging my knee on the rear fender on my way. I launched into the driver's seat while simultaneously closing the door behind me. The figures were almost to my passenger window, so I made sure to lock my car and rolled the windows up as fast as humanly possible. When my windows were up, I put that baby in drive and floored it. I spun gravel on the side of the road, but my car gained traction and I launched forward. It was at that time that I saw something with a horrible white face slam right up against my passenger side window. Suddenly, I saw a ton more of these things emerge from the field. It wasn't the eyes of wildlife I had been seeing. They were some sort of humanoid creatures. They let out this insane shrill scream while I was driving away, and they were all running towards my car. I can only imagine what would have happened if I hadn't rolled my windows up, or if I hadn't made it back to my car in time. Don't Drive Tired by One Fast Puerto Rican. In spring break 1997, I was heading out to Houston from Lubbock and looking forward to a nice weekend of doing nothing. With a few stops, the drive normally takes about 8.5 to 9 hours. The plan was to stop in Austin for the night at a good friend's and then head out to Houston, about 2.5 hours away, the next morning. For the record, I was driving an '85 Sentra hatchback. No AC, no cruise control. Thanks, Dad. Due to work commitments, I couldn't leave Lubbock until about 6 p.m. I stopped at a friend's house for a quick bite before hitting the road, and it was now 7. The drive itself was very uneventful until I got to Austin. About 12:30 in the morning, I reached Austin and found a bank of payphones before the era everyone had a cell phone. I called my friend to say, "I'm not tired. Really, I'm just going to make the short drive to Houston." My buddy says, "Are you sure? It's pretty late, man." I say, "Yeah, I'm good. I'll call you in the morning when I'm in H-Town." I hang up, fill up the tank before heading out again. It's now 1 a.m. At 2:30 a.m., I reach Brenham and can barely keep my eyes open. I'm doing every trick in the book. Loud music, window open, slapping face, punching myself. Nothing is working. Just past Brenham on 290 is a combination levee bridge highway designed to keep the freeway high and dry during big floods. The last thing I remember was closing my eyes and opening them suddenly to see my car plunging down the levee with me inside it. I must have been doing between 60 and 70 miles per hour when I went downhill, and luckily the high grass kept me from either overturning or nailing the bottom of the levee. So, I stopped about 15 feet from the bottom of the levee. It's the middle of the night, and no one can see my car down the embankment. No cell phone, no witnesses, car won't start. After a quick check on myself, I got out of the car and stumbled out the driver's side door. I started climbing up the levee to flag down someone to help. Yeah, right. People are just going to stop when they see some Mexican-looking fellow waving his arms in the middle of nowhere at 2:45 in the morning. Finally, an 18-wheeler stopped and I borrowed his cell phone. I called my dad, who was unsure of what to do. "Thanks, Pop." But then I called a wrecker to pull my car out. The trucker offered to wait until the wrecker arrived, but I got really creeped out just sitting there, so I said, "Yeah, I'm good. I'll just wait by the side of the road." The trucker left, and I was all alone again. After a few minutes, I realized that I'll probably be waiting for an hour for the wrecker, so I decide to get back in my car and see if I can't throw it in reverse. Not sure if I had an angel on my shoulder, but the car fired right up. As I threw it into reverse, it truly felt like a Christmas miracle. All the way up the embankment, I drove backwards and made it to the top by the side of the freeway. Got out and checked around. Wheels? Okay. Body damage? Nothing too noticeable. Engine? Looks like the underneath of a lawnmower, but it all looks okay. Belts are still belting. Let's go. I put it in first gear and I heard a wobble from the wheels. Not sure what it was, but nothing's going to stop me from making it to Houston, damn it. My top speed after the accident was about 40 miles an hour. I reached my parents' house at about 5 in the morning. Tired, sore, and still a bit in shock, I told my parents what happened before I collapsed in my bed. When I woke up sometime around noon, I went to survey the damage. I had completely stripped 2 of the 4 lugs off the right wheel and 1 lug off the left wheel. I'm damn lucky that 1 or both wheels didn't fly off the car after my accident. I also realized that if I had gone off 15 seconds later, my car probably would have been upside down in that creek. So, yeah, never pass up a chance to sleep during a long road trip. Bad Neighborhood, submitted by Razor Rod. Many moons ago, on Thanksgiving, my wife and I were going to spend the holiday at her sister's house with her extended family in Collinsville, Illinois. We lived outside of Kansas City, Missouri, and we were just going to make the drive over. The problem was, we both had to work late Thanksgiving Eve at our jobs. Yeah, you'd think that very cool employers would let people out a little early, but not so for us, at least not back then. So, after we got our things together, got our dogs in our RAV4 and started to shove off on the 4-hour drive, we didn't leave until about 8 p.m. We could have waited until the morning, but we didn't want to travel on the holiday. We just wanted to wake up with our family and enjoy the day's festivities. I drove for the first couple of hours, and let my wife spell me at the wheel afterwards, as she was more familiar with the drive over through St. Louis. I kind of drifted off slightly, remembering that there was a funny jog we needed to take off I-70 to get to a bridge to get into Illinois. If you're from the area, I'm talking about the McKinley Bridge. So it was about an hour or so after I conked out that my wife asked me to wake up and help her remember to get off at the right place. As I mentioned, it's a quick turnaround to get onto McKinley Street and then the bridge. But unfortunately, by the time she woke me up, she was already off I-70 and now driving through neighborhoods. Having made this trip with her more than once, but again not as familiar with the territory, I just said, "Honey, this doesn't look right at all." She said, "I know. I don't know where to turn though." Guys, this is before GPS and smartphones. Yeah, we had a road map, but we were in a residential area, and as I was fumbling to grab the map, I kept asking her to tell me what streets she was passing. It was late, we were both tired, and she was getting frustrated with me because I couldn't give her immediate directions as to where to go. I finally told her to pull over as soon as she could, and she got to the next cross street. I needed to figure out where the fuck we were, and in the back of my mind I was thinking, what a great way to start out Thanksgiving. My wife's pissed off at me for something I didn't even do. When she stopped, I turned on the overhead light in our SUV to get an idea of where we were. I took a quick look around and we were at the corner of North 20th Street and Penrose. I don't like to look down on people, but this neighborhood looked pretty sketch, and as I mentioned, yeah, it was late. So I tried to look at the map and figure out where we needed to go to get to McKinley Street and the bridge. It looked like a straight shot down Penrose to North 11th Street, so I told my wife that, and she said okay, finally starting to calm down a bit. I looked back at our dogs who were still asleep in the back and gave a soft laugh and said, "Hey, sometimes you have to go off the beaten path for a more interesting trip." Looking back, I wish I would have kept my mouth shut. No sooner than I had said that, than the back of our RAV4 dipped, and there was a tap on the glass of the driver's side door. My wife had been looking at me as I'd been looking at the map, and we both turned at the same time to see a guy in dark clothing tapping with what looked like a gun on the window. I looked closer, and in fact, it didn't just look like a gun. It was a gun. My wife screamed, and I told her to just floor it. For whatever reason, she froze, and the guy hauled his hand back with the gun, and I thought he was going to punch the glass with it if we didn't leave. Somehow, my wife got herself back into reality, put the RAV4 into drive, and stepped on the gas. We heard some muffled yelling, but we didn't care. I mean, my wife was hysterical at this point, and I was trying to reassure her that it was okay. We just needed to get out of this neighborhood. I told her, no cop, no stop. Just get to North 11th Street and make a right. She didn't want to at first and wanted to stop at every intersection, but I just yelled at her to get the fuck out of here. We kept hearing this muffled yelling, and I couldn't figure out what the hell it was. But when we finally got to North 11th Street, my wife did come to a complete stop. Suddenly, the back of the RAV4 bounced again, and I spun around to see a man standing behind our vehicle holding a gun. We heard him yell, "You dumb motherfuckers! You tried to kill me!" Apparently, he had stepped onto the back of our RAV4 and for the last few blocks as we sped out of that place, had been holding onto the spare wheel mounted on the back. I told my wife, "Go!" She hit the gas, and we tore back to the big intersection where we needed to make a left to finally get to the McKinley Bridge. To say we were shook up is an understatement. My wife was crying at this point, and the dogs had started freaking out after the guy was yelling, and of course the commotion of us speeding around. But we got out of there unscathed. We made it over the bridge into Illinois and finally to Collinsville. When we pulled into my sister-in-law's driveway, it was just after midnight. I herded the dogs inside while my wife ran in ahead of me. I went back for our bags while she told her family, who was still awake having drinks and just sitting around talking, about what had just happened. My father-in-law kind of snickered when he heard that we had just been driving around late at night in Hyde Park, what we found out was a really bad neighborhood of St. Louis. My wife hadn't yet gotten to the part about the guns, and when she did, the laughter stopped. Everyone got really serious, and was very happy that we got out of there okay, and didn't get into more trouble. We ended up having an awesome Thanksgiving, but the buzz for the next 2 days was all about our wayward trip into what I would later find out was truly a very dangerous neighborhood. These days, I'm so thankful for the technology we have when we're driving so as to avoid neighborhoods like that. And on top of that, my wife and I have made a deal that we will no longer make trips at night, only during the day. Stalked on the Back Roads by Crimson. A little background. I was about 8 when my mother, little sister, and I were taking a road trip across Wyoming. This wasn't unusual, as we had family living all across the state, and my mom loved piling us in the car and driving. My memory of this event is patchy, but I remember it more for the way my mom reacted than for the event itself. I don't remember exactly where this was, or where we were headed, but anyone who has ever driven through Wyoming knows that the roads are mostly deserted. We'd been driving several hours behind an older green and white truck. We were approaching a gas station, and I remember my little sister being so excited because she wanted to get those little bottles made of wax that had juice in them. The green and white truck pulled into the gas station, and we followed. We used the restrooms, got some snacks, my mom filled us up with gas, and we got back into the car and back onto the road. A little time passed, and my mom asked, "Is that truck behind us the same one that we followed into the gas station?" I turned in my seat and confirmed that it was the same truck. I sat back down and continued gorging myself on snacks, but I sensed that my mom was uneasy. She kept looking in her rearview mirror and watching that truck. It was a long drive to the next gas station, and along the way, the truck behind us would speed up and get dangerously close to us, and then back away a little. After a stretch of several miles, we were nearing another gas station. My mom adjusted her mirror so she could see us in the back seat. She said, "I'm going to pull into this gas station and open my door like I'm getting out. I don't want you two to open your doors. Don't get out. Just sit tight and hang on." My little sister and I looked at each other like, okay. I thought it was strange, but the look in her eyes scared me a little. My mom is a calm person, but she has this presence about her that makes you aware that she isn't to be messed with. All of my friends throughout the years have been more than a little scared of her, which is odd considering she's just over 5 feet tall and about 100 pounds. Anyway, we pulled into the station and up to a pump. My mom adjusted her mirror to see behind us and opened her door with the car still running. The green and white truck pulled in and parked just to the side of the turn-in. The driver popped his hood, got out, came around to the front of his truck, and propped up his hood. He started messing around under the hood with his back to us, and from what I remember of him, he was a really big guy, but who isn't to an 8-year-old girl? My mom slammed her door and peeled out of the gas station. I turned in my seat to watch the man. He turned around like he was startled, looked right at us, quickly closed his hood, even though he had only been looking in there for a few seconds. At this point, my mom is driving so fast that I lose sight of him. I was terrified, and I knew it must be serious for my mom to drive like this. Up ahead, the road bent sharply to the left, and there was a small road to the right of a few buildings. Just before the bend, my mom slammed on the brakes, pulled the steering wheel all the way to the right, and, as if it were straight out of an action movie, slides around the corner. She sped through the small parking lot of one of the buildings and parked it. From our vantage point, we were hidden from traffic behind us, but we could see anyone passing. A short time later, we watched the green and white truck speed right past us and around the bend in the road. Obviously, my sister and I were very shaken up. My mom asked if we needed to use the restroom, and we said yes. She said she did too, but we would wait here for a bit and then make our way to the next station. I'll never forget what she said next, because it was so out of character for her. She said, "I'd rather piss my pants in this car than be murdered on the side of the road." A little time passed, and we got back on the road, and we continued on our trip. We never saw that truck again. The Forest Road, submitted by Funky Boss Carl. My friends and I had decided to do some fishing on the Coosa River in Alabama last summer, and this would be 2018 for those that care. Not the main river that runs into Jordan Lake, but closer to Hatchet Creek, maybe a couple of miles over the river from Higgins Ferry. There was me, Joey, and Marty. My name is Carl for reference. It was a nice hot day, and we were just out for some crappie, bass, and channel cat. We'd brought along plenty of gear, sandwiches, and water, and Bud Light. We were having a blast catching, or in some cases not catching anything, the latter for Marty, but we were still enjoying the day, fishing and just hanging out. I remember at one point thinking that we were being watched, but I'm not a superstitious guy. I shrugged it off and just figured there were other people out fishing and maybe walking behind us in the woods. We had walked down a path where we had left my Jeep and then had to trek through a bunch of trees to get to the river at a point where there were some rocks at the edge of the trees. Where we were, there was no beaches or anything like that. In short, it's just the middle of nowhere. We stopped fishing to have some lunch and relax in the shade, and I brought up the fact that I thought I heard somebody else walking around in the woods. And Marty, the guy who wasn't catching anything, said, "Yeah, I thought I heard something too, but who knows? Could be anything. There's tons of animals out here, you know that. And even if it wasn't animals, it could just be other folks out for a hike, or maybe they're fishing too." I lit up a smoke and said, "Yeah, you're probably right then." We continued to fish for the rest of the afternoon, and when it started to get dark, we talked about heading home. Joey came from a pretty shitty family and didn't really want to go home right away, and he suggested that maybe we just go on a drive through the back roads for a while, until it got dark. We all knew about his family, and the three of us were really close, so I figured, what the hell, I drove, we've got more buds than we need, so why don't we just have a slow cruise through the woods? It was then about 7 p.m., and while the sun doesn't set until around 8 at that time of the year, when you're out in the woods, things get darker a heck of a lot faster. I'm pretty sure anybody who spends time outside knows this. So we packed up our gear and got back to my Jeep Wrangler and loaded up. Everyone took a pause that refreshes, and I remember firing up a smoke, still getting that weird feeling that something was a little off on this day. We jumped in the Jeep. I put on some Holiday Gunfire, a pretty cool band from Birmingham that my older brother had turned me on to. A quick sidebar. They're a really cool band. You should check them out. I began driving back to where the dirt path turned into a more civilized road. Then I started looking for some of the other off-road paths. When I say off-road, I mean just dirt paths, not like crazy mudding paths. We were just driving along, having a few smokes and beers, and as it got darker and darker, I had to turn the lights on. We were driving for a little while longer, and it came to a dead end in another dirt road. We all stopped to have another pause that refreshes before turning around. And again, I got that weird feeling that something just wasn't right, but I didn't mention it to the other guys. It was then that I suggested we head home for Clinton, something to eat and maybe another beer or two at a bar. Everyone agreed, and I started to turn my Jeep around to make the trip back. It was now pitch black out there as we made our way down the path we had just come. All of a sudden, Marty, who was riding shotgun, said, "Hey, what is that?" I hadn't seen it yet, but suddenly I did. I slowed down, and that's when all three of us saw that there was a rope or some kind of cord strung across the path between two trees. Hanging from the rope were the severed heads of 3 or 4 possums and a couple of raccoons. Those were certainly not there when we first came through. I mean, how the hell would we have driven right by that and not seen it? It was high enough that I could get under it, and we slowly did so while Marty was taking a video of it on his phone. I would share that with you, but unfortunately Marty no longer has that phone after it fell into a pool and he lost all of his data. Anyway, we were kind of shaken up. I mean, who wouldn't be? We were freaked out, and I picked up the pace and got back to the highway and headed south for a freeway to get back home. I couldn't stop talking about what we had just seen, and I assure you, this was not something out of a few Bud Lights that we had. Someone had to have been following us for whatever reason and hung those heads to make sure that we would see them. Of course, it could have been just a prank, and I don't want to go too deep into what might have been happening out there, but it was still totally strange and totally random. We actually went back the following week, but the heads were gone and there was no rope or whatever hanging between the trees. That makes us think that whatever or whoever did that did it deliberately to scare us. All I can say to whoever was out there that did that in an attempt to freak us out? Hey, mission accomplished. You Are Gonna Die by Fumscappy. One night, I was out getting gas, and after I left, I pulled up to a red light behind a beater car, and we were both turning right onto a 2-lane highway. We both make the right, and his car doesn't go very fast, so I head for the left lane. He blocks me. I headed for the right lane. He immediately killed his signal and cut me off again. This continued for a little while before I got annoyed, so I gun it and go to pass him. Again, while in the process of passing, this guy takes a dive at my car, which slows me down. He's yelling at me out his window, "You aren't passing me, motherfucker!" And he's laughing maniacally. We got caught at another light, and he started chucking stuff at my car. I checked the traffic and gunned it through the red light. I'm sufficiently creeped out now. His car seems to be faster than I initially thought, and he's keeping up with me through traffic. In desperation, I started turning off side streets, and he was following me. We got to another light, and I asked what his problem is, and he screams, literally screams at me, "You are gonna die tonight!" Holy fuck. So I chuck an old coffee into his car, turn off my lights, and take the fuck off as fast as I could go. At this point, stoplights aren't a concern anymore. I want to be pulled over. I'm ripping through little towns at 100 miles an hour in 25 and 30 mile an hour zones. I was starting to lose him. I finally ducked into a side street and somehow found a driveway that was next to a garage. I pulled up next to it, turned off the lights with the car still on, and waited. 1 minute, 3 minutes, 10 minutes. I finally got home about 45 minutes later, white as a ghost. I called the police. I didn't have my cell at the time, and I reported this guy in. I never found out if anything happened, and I never saw that car or guy again. But I literally thought I was going to be murdered. For nothing. How did this happen? Submitted by Anonymous. Hey, Uncle Josh. I'm sending you this story, and I would like to remain anonymous. It's a very strange but embarrassing story that I haven't told anyone other than my family. I think you'll see why as the story goes along, if you so choose to read it. I was encouraged to share my story because I have just watched a show on the History Channel about something very similar that happened to me. Not to the extent of what happened to that guy, but There is this strange gap in time that I can't explain, and neither can my family. I'm in my early 30s, and I work for my father. I have since high school. He's owned a number of businesses, and still does. One of them includes transportation of vehicles and trailers. This also includes mobile homes and things like that. Basically, when he makes a purchase or a sale, I drive a flatbed or whatever truck is needed to move whatever merchandise he needs to have moved. It could be a car, it could be a camper, it could be whatever comes down the pipeline that we can transport. Concerning the story that I'm sending you, I had to drive a vehicle from our headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia to Brookhaven, West Virginia. Not a problem. Got in the truck, loaded things up, and took off. When I got to the final stop, my father called and said he got a sweet deal on a Range Rover for a customer, but it was located outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He wanted me to continue heading north to pick up the Range Rover and then bring it back to Atlanta. At this time, it was a Thursday afternoon around 2:30. He told me that while he knew it wasn't the original plan, and I did have some pretty serious plans with friends that weekend, we were actually heading to the coast to do some deep-sea fishing. He apologized, but said he really needed me to do this, and what's a devoted son going to do? Of course I said yes, and I thought I could make the trip back that night if I left at a decent time. Getting to Pittsburgh was only about an hour and a half away from where I was in West Virginia. So, if I left at 4 and really made good time, I could probably get back to Atlanta at 2 or 3 in the morning. My dad told me because he was doing this, he was going to give me Friday off to get ready for my trip. And you know what? I thought that was a deal and a half. I got the address and the name of the guy who was selling us the Range Rover, and off north I went. The load-up was a snap, and I was on my way a little after 4 p.m. As the term goes, I was southbound and down. Before I shoved off, I loaded up on Mountain Dew and snacks. Very rare for me as I'm kind of a fitness nut, but I thought the caffeine would help me make the trip. It was uneventful, and as I continued on, I didn't have to stop for gas until about 5 hours later, and I got off 77 to fuel up in a town called Bland, Virginia. I walked around for a little bit to stretch my legs, and I noticed a strange light in the sky. I should mention that this was in August and the skies were clear. Lots of stars out that night, but this one was shining brighter than the others. I just thought maybe a comet or something. I just got some more food and drinks and headed back on the road. Now here's where the weird part starts. As I got onto the ramp to get back onto 77, I noticed that the light in the sky that I had noticed earlier was now much bigger. I remember that there weren't that many people on the interstate at that time, but I paid no mind to it, just thinking about the cool trip that we were going to go on that weekend. I was so ready to hit the ocean. It was a bunch of my high school friends getting back together, and that's really what was preoccupying my brain. So, again, southbound and down, moving as fast as I could, but also knowing that I had an extremely expensive vehicle on my flatbed. Every once in a while, I would look out my driver's side window and see that light still seemed to be getting bigger. This is going to sound corny, but the first thing that I thought of was my Sunday school teachings and the star in the sky that had everyone going to see Jesus. If I recall correctly, it's the Star of Bethlehem. I know it's kind of dumb, but I'm just saying what I first thought of. I kept on going and everything was moving smoothly. I glanced over again, and the light was even brighter this time, and I wondered if anyone else on the road was seeing what I was seeing. Just before the North Carolina border, my check engine light came on, and my heart sank. I pulled over on the shoulder of the road to see if it was something simple, because with this truck that I've been driving, sometimes things like this happen from time to time. It was a sturdy Ford, but once in a while would act up. I had to remind myself of that. So I popped the hood, got out, and went and checked all the belts, fluids, all that kind of stuff to see if anything was wrong. There didn't seem to be any issue. Nothing smelled funny, nothing seemed off. The truck was operating fine. As far as I could tell, it was tip-top. I got back into the cab, and that's when I noticed a light on the highway up ahead of me. But it wasn't in the sky. It looked like a spotlight on a stage. I'm sure your listeners are already thinking this guy is out of his head, but I could not be more serious than I am right now. This white light came straight towards my truck, and in seconds my entire vehicle was bathed in this gigantic bright light. I strained my neck after rolling down the window to see what the heck was going on. I kind of freaked out. so I just put it in drive and started going like a madman back down 77. Now, I said we got weird back then, but this is where it gets really screwed up. I have zero recollection of driving through North Carolina. I don't remember going through Charlotte or getting onto 85. From where I was when I saw that light, I probably had another 5 hours and change to go to get to Atlanta, so it should have been around 2 or 3 in the morning when I got there. It wasn't. I rolled into the lot of my father's business at 10 p.m. That's what the clock in the truck read. That's what my watch said. That's what the little neon clock that hangs over the door to my father's office said. I sat there dumbfounded for at least 10 minutes. I didn't know what to do. I called my dad and said, "Hey, I'm here." And he was as flabbergasted as me. He said, "What do you mean you're here?" And I said, "I'm at the shop. I've got the Range Rover." There was a long pause on the phone, and he said, "Son, that's impossible." I just said, "Dad, I'm here." And again, he was silent, and he said, "Son, if you're pulling my leg, I'm going to beat your ass." Then he said he would be down in a few minutes. I sat in my truck in a daze wondering what the hell had happened. I had the manifest right next to me. 4:07 p.m., Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. A 10 to 11-hour trip, yet here I was just 6 hours later. My dad finally got there and got out of his truck. He didn't know what to say. I hopped out and waved him over to check the Range Rover, and he stepped forward but then stopped. I asked what was wrong, and he asked if I'd been smoking reefer. I said I hadn't. Why? He said I just smelled like burnt cinnamon or something, then finally walked over closer. He looked at the Range Rover, looked at me, and then grabbed me by the elbow gently and said, "Are you okay, son?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." I then remembered about the bright light and told him about it, and he just shook his head. He just said, "All right, let's unload this guy and then head for home." I was happy to hear that, let me tell you. We took care of business, and he asked me to come back to my family's house for the night rather than my apartment. He said that we'd come back the next day to grab my pickup. I was really happy because I was really tired for some reason, and on top of it, I was confused. I just agreed and followed my dad's lead. When we got back to my childhood home, my mom was awake and making food. I'm a Polish guy, and Polish moms make food for any reason, especially when they're worried. So I washed up and sat down to pierogi and kielbasa with my mom and dad and recapped the night. They were both wigged out, but I could tell they knew I was telling the truth about my drive in this lost period of time. My mom made me take off my t-shirt and pants as she said she couldn't stand the smell of this cinnamon scorch or whatever it was that was on them. So I took a shower to see if that lessened the smell. After a bit, I crawled into my living room and crashed on the couch to watch Chips reruns before I fell asleep. I know there's no super cool holy shit moment to this story, and the ending might sound lame, but that's really what happened to me. I cannot explain how I made up or lost that time on my way to Atlanta. It never happened again, and I really hope it doesn't. Anyone out there in podcast land got any ideas? I'm all ears to listen to what you think might have happened.